Okay, Randy.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially we want to thank our guest today, Christian Sorensen. My name is Randy LaPrairie. I'm a professor of sociology, and I've done research on militarism and American imperialism, American military imperialism. And we have Christian Sorensen here today, who is the author of a very authoritative book called Understanding the War Industry, which is about the contemporary American military industrial complex. And he's going to talk to us today about that. I've asked Christian to talk specifically about a few things. First, just if he could talk to us about what the military industrial complex is, basically, but then specifically the Biden administration's military industrial complex and their connections to the military industry, to the war industry. And I've also asked him to talk about how that relates to the Biden administration's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And finally, I've asked Christian to talk about suggestions or recommendations for the anti-war movement or local anti-war organizations and how they can grow and be influential locally. So that's what I hope we can talk about today. And before we start, Christian, I know on the back of your book, your biography says that you are a researcher and an author focused on the US war industry, and that your background is in translation in international affairs, and that you're a veteran. But I'm personally very curious if you could start your whole talk by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you became an anti-war activist and an anti-war scholar. I'd love to hear that.
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me. Kalamazoo, more broadly, thank you for having me. Randy, thank you for getting in touch with me. Daniel, Stephen, John, everyone, sincerely appreciate this opportunity. These are the meetings that matter and the groups that really matter. So it means a lot on this end. I ask everyone to please mute yourself at the beginning, if at all possible. Make sure we have no interference on that end. And yeah, so I was in the military very briefly, 4 years, quick enlistment, Air Force. And, people, to answer your question, Randy, people react differently to the propaganda they're fed on the inside. And some people double down on it. Some people really, really absorb it and almost enjoy it. They enjoy being a part of the group. They really buy into it. And other people go the other way. And I think I went out the other way. I did not enjoy being a cog in the machine. And I took the time to educate myself while I was on the inside, reading various authors who have already paved the way and learning from peace groups, much like yours while I was in. And so, yeah, I just, I did not like being a cog in the machine. I quickly woke up to the waste of the entire apparatus. And particularly when deployed, I mean, you could not dream up a more wasteful way to spend time, money, effort, research and development, brain power, the whole works. And so once you see these things, it's hard to unsee. And so, I wasn't I'm not particularly bright in any way. I'm not particularly gifted in anti-war organizing or anything. I just happened to see what I saw and reacted quite negatively to it. So I finished my enlistment, I got out, and I started using the knowledge that I had being 4 years on the inside for what I believe is a good purpose. I don't call myself an activist, though I am fine with you referring to me as such. I simply believe that my foundation in the military allows me to research in a grounded way. Most people are familiar with the military through what is presented to them on corporate media or Hollywood, and these are wildly inaccurate portrayals. And so I think just to use my knowledge in a decent way, that's all I'm trying to do. So thank you all. Thank you for having me. I will share my screen and we will get going. Let me know if you can see everything. You should see a presentation. If not, let me know. All right, can y'all see that? Somebody say yes, so I know we're getting this.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Stephen.
I can see it.
Awesome, excellent. Okay, so to begin, the war industry. War Industry 101. I'm going to talk briefly about the military-industrial complex, which you are familiar with, and then we will proceed to the Biden administration, and we will then end with the U.S. militarization of Eastern Europe over the past several years, and brief comments on Ukraine and the crisis there. So what is the war industry? The war industry is comprised of the corporations that develop, market, and sell goods and services to the US military, intelligence agencies, and to allied governments. Okay? The war industry is corporations that sell to military, intelligence, and other governments. It's the famous iron, it's 1/3 of the famous Iron Triangle. One side is military, the military establishment, which is headquartered in the Pentagon. The other side of the triangle is industry, which is what I research. These are the corporations. And then the other side of the triangle is Congress, and to some extent the executive branch. And their job in the whole thing is to pass legislation that funds the racket and to pass legislation that is favorable to industry. Notable war corporations. You should be familiar, we all should be, as citizens and residents of North America, with these corporations. You're likely familiar with Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing's militant wing, which is called Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. Boeing is slightly unique among the larger war corporations in that it is basically divided in half. There's the commercial aviation branch, and then there is the militant wing focused on selling to military intelligence. L3 Harris is another massive corporation. Huntington Ingalls specializes in primarily shipbuilding. And then there are others, some lesser known corporations. Honeywell, Bose Allen Hamilton, Leidos, Amentum, SAIC, CACI, KBR, and Textron. It's important to note that these corporations are constantly selling bits and pieces and acquiring bits and pieces of one another. So this landscape changes over time. And some examples we'll get to in a moment. So we have at the top of the war industry, banks and asset management firms, okay? Essentially Wall Street, writ large. Financial firms hold most stock of any given large war corporation. They vote the shares that control nearly all large war corporations. They are structurally bound to pursue the maximization of short-term profit. Every quarter, they have to maximize profit. And they will do anything to maximize this profit. Some of these institutional stockholders you're familiar with. JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock is quite infamous, State Street, Vanguard. Again and again, if you use a search engine, preferably not Google, if you use DuckDuckGo to search for war corporation's name and then institutional stockholders, you come up with these lists. Yahoo Finance curates them. A few of the other financial monitoring organizations do. And yeah, State Street, Vanguard, Wellington show up regularly. BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, again and again. Private equity is something that we don't know enough about with respect to its activities within the war industry. Private equity is when a small group of very wealthy people acquire a corporation. They keep it in their private hands. It's not public. It's not listed on stock exchanges. Then they tweak the organization. Usually they cut a lot of jobs, they consolidate some things. Sometimes they buy other corporations and blend it with that corporation. And then they eventually sell it. And their whole goal here, please mute yourself. Their whole goal here is to make a profit after they've shaped the corporation a bit. So private equity is all over the war industry. Perhaps the most salient example recently is Amentum. Okay, Lindsay Goldberg is a private equity firm. It created Amentum by purchasing the management services division of a engineering conglomerate called AECOM, AECOM. So it purchased a portion of AECOM that specialized mostly in base operations, running military bases. Then it purchased another corporation called DynCorp, which was famous during for some mercenary activities during the Iraq War. It also does aircraft maintenance, stuff like that. So it blended those two together. Then it recently purchased a corporation called PAE. PAE does a lot of espionage. It does a lot of information technology, computers, hardware, software, that kind of thing. It does some base operations. So it blended all of these together. And now Amentum is a huge, huge corporation in the war industry. And it is owned by private equity. It's also important to note that at the bottom of this slide, Regent Equity Partners is a private equity firm, I believe based in Beverly Hills, California, actually. It owns Sightline Media Group. Sightline Media Group publishes many of the news outlets that cover war. So if you go to Defense News or Army Times or Air Force Times or Marine Corps Times or C4ISR Net, these are all ultimately owned by private equity. So that further distorts our understanding of matters of war and peace. So the war industry is famously spread across all states. All 50 states have some war industry within them. Some corporations that develop, market, and sell goods and services to the military, to intelligence organizations, and to other capitalist governments. However, there are concentrations of the war industry throughout the United States, locations where the war industry is just piled up. And they are listed here. Northern Virginia, all the way up through Baltimore, Maryland, is a huge industry hub. Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, Greater Dallas-Fort Worth is another huge war industry location. Huntsville, Alabama, famously, another massive war industry location. Greater Boston, parts of California, Silicon Valley, and lots of Southern California, including Los Angeles, San Diego. The larger portion of Denver, which includes Littleton, Centennial, and Aurora, Colorado, parts of Florida, and parts of Ohio. Those are really just the main hubs. So I've been asked to discuss Michigan here a little bit. Michigan's not bad. This slide is from the Pentagon's office called the OLDCC. It's the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. It basically keeps track of, from the Pentagon's point of view, where the money's going and what corporations are operating in what states. And so as you can see on the list on the right here, General Dynamics is by far the biggest war corporation that is operating in Michigan in terms of money received from Pentagon contracts. And you can see up top, it says Michigan accounts for 1.1% of total US military spending. Okay. So Michigan, it's 24th, coming in at 6.8 billion spent in the state. So it's up there, but it's not, you don't have a huge war industry presence as you do in some other states. Grand Rapids is a industry location. Sterling Heights is a huge industry location. So there has been some deindustrialization of the auto industry in Greater Detroit over the last, let's say, 50 years. Okay. It was once Motor City. It still has some civilian automobile infrastructure, production, manufacturing capacity. but it really has a fair amount of military vehicle production capacity. So Sterling Heights is a suburb of Detroit, and Sterling Heights pops up again and again and again in the public military contracts that I study and that I distill and I try to learn from. BAE Systems is a British corporation headquartered in London, but a lot of its production capacity is here in the United States, spread across the United States. BAE Systems makes armored vehicles and parts of other combat vehicles in Sterling Heights. General Dynamics, we remember from the slide earlier, the #1 war corporation in terms of money received in operations in the state of Michigan, makes the Abrams tank. The Pentagon is constantly buying and upgrading these tanks, and General Dynamics is the prime contractor for that. You have a few other smaller, more than a few, you have a fair number of smaller war corporations that make parts for vehicles and components for vehicles in Sterling Heights, including American Rheinmetall vehicles, which makes fighting vehicles and parts for other corporations' products, and other small businesses. But the big ones, yeah, General Dynamics, BAE Systems, etc. Grand Rapids has some war industry. It's not a ton. L3Harris is one of the top war corporations, as we discussed earlier. It makes some avionics there, produces different components for aircraft, but it's not a huge hub. Kalamazoo doesn't have too much going on in terms of a war industry. There is a corporation there called Parker Hannifin Corporation. Its hydraulic systems division is headquartered in Kalamazoo. It makes components in other locations, but that's where that particular division is headquartered. It focuses on aircraft, parts for aircrafts, parts for land vehicles, mostly hydraulic systems and systems for power generation. There are some construction corporations in Kalamazoo that have done work for the U.S. military, but these are not they're not anomalies in terms of their size or their scope. The U.S. military, the Pentagon, the U.S. military establishment is the contracts every single duty day, every single business day with construction firms. It's, by my tally, it is the largest employer of construction workers in the United States. It's constantly building new military facilities, training facilities, military ranges here in the United States, and repairing existing military bases and military infrastructure. And so it doesn't do it itself, the U.S. military. It contracts out to corporations. So how do war corporations present themselves? The corporation itself, any given corporation of moderate to large size, is typically a master of public relations. You have to be. So these corporations present themselves as job creators, as providing solutions. You'll see that term all the time. If you go to any war corporation's website, oh, we're just providing solutions. It sounds nice. We're helping government solve problems. You know, it sounds really nice. Euphemisms are employed every second of every day in the war industry. Because if they talked about what they were really doing, which is what I was told in training, the military does, break stuff and kill people, then that wouldn't go over. It's not palatable. You have to use euphemisms. You have to be a master of public relations. Corporations say we're supporting critical programs of national significance. Sounds all right. Giving our troops the tools they need, and on and on and on. The corporate personhood has gained more and more authority over the last 50 years, since basically the 1970s. So we must understand the military-industrial complex as part of the larger expansion of corporate authority since, well, actually, yes, since back to World War II, since the signing, World War II ended in 1945. So in the signing of the passage of the National Security Act in 1947 was when this whole permanent armaments industry was just, that was the last nail on the coffin that really entrenched the whole thing. The National Security Act of 47 established CIA. It separated the Air Force as its own branch of the own military branch, and it allowed the standing war industry to continue to grow, and it hasn't stopped ever since. The Lewis Powell memo was a defining moment. Lewis Powell was a businessman's businessman. He made no bones about his business credentials. He absolutely believed in big business being able to do what it wants, when it wants. And his memo to the larger business community outlined tactics to increase corporate authority. And they've largely followed these tactics, whether they understand it or not, since then. This included getting in media, flooding it with corporate thought, getting more capitalist views in universities and in academic journals, and on and on and on. Getting rid of regulation that might infringe on a little bit of corporate profit, lobbying, stacking the courts, getting involved in the judicial process. And Lewis Powell himself went on to be a Supreme Court justice. So there are a number of cases that helped, that the Supreme Court saw and ruled on, and in turn helped corporate authority gain more and more and more and more authority in U.S. public life. Buckley, Vallejo, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti. These basically said gradually, corporations can influence the political process. Limits on election spending are unconstitutional. Corporations have First Amendment right to put money toward ballot initiatives. Any prohibition on corporate expenditure, unconstitutional. You can utilize nonprofits as a way of influencing the political process. Corporations, Citizens United versus FEC, famous in 2010, allowed corporations to spend unlimited amounts, basically, on political contributions, and on and on and on. So it's a steady encroachment. So now we're at a point now where the war industry and other corporations, this is not just limited to the war industry, but the war industry is a master of this, has many different ways to influence federal policy. Lobbying is perhaps the most famous. Campaign finance. If you're running for Congress, I finance your campaign. I'm the corporation. I finance your campaign. When you get into office, you owe me. You owe me big time. Corporate officials in top Pentagon offices. Rotating corporate officials in and out of the Pentagon offices. The top Pentagon offices, the civilian offices, used to be staffed by career civil servants. They are now increasingly former corporate officials who go into the Pentagon for a few years, rotate out after a couple of years. While they're on the inside, they help corporate authority. And when they get back on the outside, they go back into the war industry or other complementary industries and use their knowledge that they gained on the inside for corporate profit. The revolving door. Media and think tanks operations, playing the jobs card with elected officials. It's another way of confining the elected officials. You say, hey, we're going to bring 200 jobs or 200 more jobs to your district. They never have to come through with that amount. They might bring some, but the lawyers in the fine print make sure that they never have to come through with whatever they promise. It's all public relations, and it's another way of confining the politician. And then corporations are increasingly running policy processes themselves within the Pentagon. So I study contracts, the public contracts that are available on the Pentagon's website. And you can see in these contracts that corporations are increasingly tasked with coming up with policy while working for the Pentagon, coming up with military policy. Here are a few examples. Running strategic plans and policy support for the Air Force, strategic assessment and planning for the Navy, developing and managing policies and practices for part of the Navy. These are a few examples. Cost, cost you're familiar with. But our human minds cannot even fathom the total costs. We cannot begin to understand, in part because we're not shown, but in part because the destruction is so great. We cannot begin to understand the amount of devastation that the US military and the US war industry wreak overseas in our name, in the name of the country, and in the name of the US public. So first cost is there are X discretionary dollars every year. The military budget, as you know, hogs most of that discretionary budget. Depending on how you count any given year, it's 55 to 60% of the overall discretionary budget. Okay, so most of the discretionary budget goes toward profiteering and destruction instead of human need. Then there's the permanent warfare state and all of that entails, including domestic surveillance and global espionage. Then on top of that, you have injury, death, and trauma to civilians overseas who are the primary victims of this entire apparatus, but also US troops. The best way, if anybody's out there who says, oh, support the troops, support the troops, support the troops, all right, fine, I'm with you. But the best way to support the troops is to bring them home and take care of them. Stop sending them on, imperial missions around the world. The militarization of US society is another cost. We collectively have a very distorted understanding of military and war. We rally around the flag without understanding or examining why we're always at war. And we glorify the troops. We pay lip service for the troops, but we don't really, we don't act to stop these wars that are harming the troops. Also, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists warns regularly that our policies, our behavior, our garrisoning of the globe keeps pushing us closer and closer to nuclear annihilation. As you all know, during the Cold War, we narrowly escaped massive nuclear war on multiple occasions. It's not just our brinksmanship that brings us close to nuclear destruction, but it's also our own nukes. We're not even responsible with our own nukes. One of the best books you can read on this is Eric Schlosser's Command and Control. He basically tallies up all the instances of the US being horrible manager of its own nuclear weapons. And of course, there's pollution. There's carbon. You know that the US military is the single greatest institutional emitter of carbon. So that contributes to the current and advancing climate crisis. But the military also emits particulates when it burns fossil fuels. There's nuclear waste. There are burn pits, which is how the military often disposes of its trash overseas. Just digs a giant pit and then lights it with, tosses all the trash in there and lights it with jet fuel, which is itself a carcinogen when inhaled. And the troops always inhale this stuff and they come back with horrible pulmonary disease. Then there is PFAS. These are forever chemicals. These massive chemicals that are created in industrial processes that never go away. Then there's Superfund sites. There are toxins in the soil, the air, the water, on and on and on. And of course, corporate America gets in on this because the Pentagon then tasks corporate America to remediate all of this stuff. And not all of this stuff, because it's impossible to remediate all of it. But they get money to remediate a fraction of this stuff. And so they're winning both ways. They're winning when they create it. They get money for creating this stuff, and they get money to remediate some of it. So you have that. So I've been asked to talk about the Biden administration as it pertains to war and peace. Let me just say at the outset, I'm no fan of either capitalist political party. The blue team, Democrats, red team, the Republicans, they are both pro-war. They're both largely anti-working class. They both say, oh, let's support the troops. But they don't do anything to stop the wars. And that would go against their donors. And we'll get to that in a second. Biden's presidential campaign, most expensive ever on record. And that's in track with historical trends, okay? I'm not picking on Biden's presidential campaign in that regard, but I'm just saying it's part of the historical trajectory. Most expensive ever, easily. Massive donations the Biden administration received from Wall Street tycoons, private equity magnates, hedge funds, real estate businessmen, and of course the war industry. Biden administration is emblematic of corporate control of politics. It must be seen along the continuum. Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, Biden. They have far more in common, far more in common when it comes to foreign policy than they have not in common. So we mentioned that one way corporations control federal policy is to rotate corporate first ideologues through the halls of authority. Biden administration is no different. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, from the Obama administration to the beginning of the Biden administration, was involved in a firm called West Exec, basically West Exec. It was a consulting firm. And its job was, in part, to liaise between Silicon Valley tech firms and the US military establishment, and to help really bring them into the fold. The Intercept did some excellent reporting, and I believe The Nation magazine and In These Times did excellent reporting on this. Who's running the Pentagon? Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin was a 4-star general, and then he got out of the military, he retired, and he went to work for one of the largest war corporations, Raytheon. And then he was tapped by the Biden administration to then, after that, run the Pentagon. And he made a ton of money while at Raytheon. And this is par for the course, by the way. Back in the day, say during I don't know, the Eisenhower administration, if you were a 3 or 4-star general, you retired and you went and took your government stipend, which you could live on, no problem. And that was it. You played golf, you hung out with your family, and that was it. These days, 3 and 4-star generals, by far the majority of them, it's not even close, it's around 90%, by far the majority of them, retire and they go and work for the war industry. Their retirement stipend yearly, by the way, is 6 figures. So it's not like they need this money. Okay? These are greedy, greedy individuals. They've made it to the top of the military hierarchy in part by deferring to corporate authority and by saying yes. They're yes men. They're not pushing back against the military-industrial complex at all. In fact, when they retire, they know what they're doing. These aren't stupid people. They're excited about the prospect of profiting off of war. So these are a few other characters who are involved in the Biden administration. This is not a comprehensive slide by any means. Deputy Secretary of War Kathleen Hicks came from one of the finest war industry think tanks, CSIS. Think tanks, by the way, as we alluded to earlier, are one of the ways that war corporations and corporate authority in general control the narrative. Think tanks are not objective. They put out information that helps the bottom line, that increases the profit of the corporations and the billionaires that fund the think tanks. Think tanks put out information that helps the donors. That's it. So if you're a fossil fuel corporation, you fund a think tank. The think tank comes out with sometimes maybe climate denial, or they muddle the science isn't clear. They muddle the record a little bit, or they tout the philanthropic donations of these sociopaths who are running the country, that type of thing. Stephen Semler is one of the great independent analysts out there of the military-industrial complex. He has a newsletter called Speaking Security. Speaking Security, I think, yeah. So look him up and follow him on social media and read his work, because he really does outstanding work. This is a slide from him. Biden's proposed budget spends 18 times more on the Pentagon than on climate programs. This is what happens when you come from the war industry and you are part of the war industry and you are part of the overall military-industrial complex. You're not going to push back. So we're concluding the first half of this this talk. How to proceed when the federal government is captured by corporate interests. What do you do? What do you do? Our federal government right now, Washington, D.C., is not responsive to the public's needs, particularly at a time where we are facing a very dismal future. It is not just the climate crisis, but it is also large ecosystem collapse. We as a species have not done a good job of containing ourselves. We move into large swaths of the natural world, we raise the trees or we pollute on massive scales, and we have affected, we have disrupted, we have unbalanced the natural systems of our Earth, of the Earth. So just when we need a responsive government the most, the government is not responsive. It's responsive, but it's responsive to corporate interests. It doesn't listen to the American public. So some options. You could nationalize the large war corporations, but that would require a Congress that is responsive to the public's needs. We don't have that, okay? So where to go? There are local divestment campaigns. You can divest your city's pension fund, for example, or state investment funds or university endowments from the war industry. It can be done. The website World Beyond War, David Swanson's website, has some examples of that. So it can be done. You can work with at the state and local level to ban war profiteering, codify it, get it in the legal code. You can help unions. There is increasing union and union awareness, labor struggle, and class consciousness. The workers, right now, under capitalism, the workers create the profit, and the ruling class takes the profit. And across the country, the workers are starting to realize that how this system works. We're born into it. We're never taught about it. At least I wasn't in school. We're born into the system. We don't really think about it, but there's a greater class consciousness that is brewing. So we can help in that. And if you have enough union strength, you can push back on the decisions that are made in the C-suite, in these corporate suites, in the executive level within a corporation. You can also help worker cooperatives. If you get enough might, you can steer these companies away from war production. We have to believe that that can be done. Can get the word out about corporate criminality, particularly about war profiteers. If we lived in a healthy society, people would not be able to profit off of war. They would be shunned at best. They would be shunned from public life, polite society. So the idea that war profiteering is not just legal, but it is celebrated and encouraged in this country is something that we need to spread. We need to spread awareness about this, about the way the system works. Another thing you do is work at the local level to implement new economic systems based on cooperation, sharing, and all for all. There are many parts in Michigan and throughout the United States where there are local towns. There are towns where people know one another. It's small enough that you can start doing your best to really realize that we as a species, we're all in it together. Then you can start at the local level. I'm not saying any of this is easy, and I'm not saying it can be done tomorrow, but we have to start understanding that we as a species are in this together. We have no choice. We either ally across borders around the globe, or we don't, and we perish. Possibly the most important thing we can do is understand that there is a good chance, and I don't want to, end the halfway point on doom and gloom, but there is a good chance that we've lost, full stop, okay? In which case, we need to, no matter what, prepare for climate resiliency at the local level. Get permaculture going, get renewable energy going to the extent that we can, every home a garden, redundancy, walkable cities, potable water, prepare for not just climate crises at the state and local level, but also the inevitable climate refugees that are going to be happening 30, 40 years from now, and sooner, according to some climate models. So it's not pretty. So that is the first half. And what I will do now is go very briefly. One moment, please. to the next presentation, or the next half of this presentation. So we've gone over War Industry 101. We've talked about the broader military-industrial complex. We understand how the system works. We've talked briefly about the Biden administration, its composition, and what it stands for, who its donors are, who it's responsive to. And so how does that fit into this whole thing? Well, the Biden administration must be seen as part of a continuum wherein both capitalist political parties, the red team and the blue team, on matters of war and peace are nearly identical. They continue the wars. They inflate threats about boogeyman overseas. And they militarize large portions of the globe, including Eastern Europe. So just a disclaimer, before we begin the second half, I am not taking sides in this Ukraine conflict. I'm just trying to provide a history and a context that is completely absent on corporate media and in most Western media. So what might Moscow be seeing? So the US military has successfully, alongside the US war industry, militarized Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War in the early 90s. One of the ways it does this is it has something called prepositioned stock, stuff you might need to fight a war. It has this all across Europe in these locations: Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Poland. It has it around the world, but these are the European locations. That's number one. Then it also, US military contracts with industry in order to build up infrastructure in Eastern Europe and Europe more broadly, and indeed the world more broadly. Here are just a few examples of contracts in recent years regarding the construction activities pertaining to US military infrastructure in Eastern Europe: Bulgaria, North Macedonia, construction in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, Bulgaria again, Hungary, Romania. In March and again in August, there were contracts for building a storage complex for weaponry and vehicles in Romania. And then you come across, in the contracts that I study on the Pentagon's website, you come across with these large construction contracts for the continent. So it will list multiple firms, sometimes some local firms. The Pentagon likes to throw local companies in Europe a bone on occasion. And so it'll be a mix of US firms and local firms for construction across the continent of Europe. On top of that, the US military and the State Department sign one-on-one deals with individual governments. So here it is, one of these US Secretaries of State, Mr. Mike Pompeo, and a gentleman from Poland signing a deal here to use Polish military infrastructure. So they have army prepositioned stock. The U.S. military contracts with industry in order to build up U.S. military infrastructure in Eastern Europe. Then it signs one-on-one deals with governments across Europe, including Eastern Europe, to use their military infrastructure. Here we have Georgia, which is more on the underbelly of Russia, and Slovakia here. The Slovakia deal, note the date, February 9, 2022. I believe Russia invaded Ukraine on 24 February 2022. This deal is illustrative because the US government gave Slovakia $100 million for Slovakia to refurbish 2 air bases in Slovakia that the US will then use. This happens all the time. What would you do with $100 million? Oh, I'm sorry, we can't provide free community college education. We can't provide. There's never money for enough money for universal health care, for free education, for public infrastructure, for cancellation of student debt. Never. Yet there's always money for war. Always money for intelligence. Always. On top of that, there has been nonstop US-led military operations and exercises across Eastern Europe. Across Europe, but across Eastern Europe as well. This includes regular naval exercises in the Barents Sea and the Black Sea. That is the equivalent of Russia in doing naval exercises in the Hudson Bay, or right off the Florida Panhandle, or right off of San Diego, or in Lake Erie. Okay, for perspective there. The U.S. military brags about this stuff all the time. Here's some tweets. Provocative behavior. I will be quiet for a moment so you can read some of what the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence agencies have done in recent years. Drones, reconnaissance aircraft, bombers, all along Russia's borders. If you look toward the bottom right, there's a New York Times article that says the following. This is from June 2019. The United States is stepping up digital incursions into Russia's electric power grid in a warning to President Vladimir V. Putin, and a demonstration of how the Trump administration is using new authorities to deploy cyber tools more aggressively, current and former government officials said. Okay. And then in the middle of the screen, excellent reporting from Yahoo News, Zach Dorfman and a few others. The Trump administration, according to their reporting, gave CIA more legal authority to launch cyber attacks against the official enemies of the United States at a time and place of its choosing. So typically, yes, CIA is to a large extent a rogue organization, but what it knows how to do is to go to the executive branch in order to cover its behind. It goes to the executive branch to get the legal authorities before it does anything completely destructive or very, very out of, or something that could come back and bite them in the behind. And so it usually goes to the White House signs off, CIA goes and does its thing. Goes to the White House signs off, CIA goes and does its thing. What the Trump administration did is basically say, hey, CIA, on this issue, on the matter of cyber attacks, you choose. You don't have to keep coming back for legal authorities. We'll give you basically the blank check. Go for it. Horrible, horrible idea. Washington. So on top of all that, Washington has abandoned arms treaties. One of the vestiges of the Cold War was an arrangement of arms treaties that kept nuclear tensions down. It said, all right, at least there is a structure in place, arms agreements that prevents a degree of escalation. Under the George W. Bush administration, the US left the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Then under the Trump administration, it left the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which governed, I believe, ground-based nuclear missiles that can cover, I think it's 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. Then it left the Open Skies Treaty in 2020, and Washington has repeatedly rejected offers from Moscow and Beijing to establish a ban on weapons in space and to establish some rules governing cyber activity. So where did this all come from? About 15 years into the so-called war on terror, the war industry collectively realized, hey, the war on terror has been extremely profitable for us, the war industry, but we can't keep, it's not going to keep paying dividends down the road. So what we need to do is we need to pivot to conflict against another major industrial power. we, the war industry, cannot justify massive new government investments in nuclear weapons, in submarines, in satellite technology, in cyber weapons, yada, 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 against what is essentially a non-state, amorphous, inflated threat of people who do not have large standing armies, who do not have advanced industrial technology or capacity. We need to go against a major power like the Cold War back in the day, because that's where the real money, the big ticket items can be made. So it started basically encouraging the military side of the military industrial complex to pivot toward, hey, we need a peer or a near peer. Enter Beijing, enter Moscow. And so it basically encouraged, and the military was more than happy to comply and to jump on this bandwagon, a new Cold War with Moscow and Beijing. So the National Defense Strategy of 2018, interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in US national security. It explicitly positioned Moscow and Beijing as the new official enemies against which US military and industry shall flex. Quote, long-term strategic competitions with China and Russia are the principal priorities for the department. That is the Department of War or the Defense Department, depending on your preferred terminology. So military and industry operate together all across Europe, and in particular, some of these locations in Eastern Europe. Pardon me. Workers, skip that for now. Here are just some examples of recent sales during the Biden administration that took place in the months prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, this year. All sorts of stuff. We cannot begin to understand how profitable competition, the new Cold War, is for the war industry. It's incredibly profitable. You sell to US government, you sell to your allies around the world, and you're constantly selling upgrades and modernization of all this stuff. It is big business. Missiles, training, engines, drones, land vehicles, other sales, fighter jets, fighter jet engines, targeting pods that go on the bottom of fighter jets, mission planning software, support equipment for fighter jets, air-to-air missiles, land vehicles. US Congress's job is to fund the whole thing and to pass legislation favorable to the US war industry, and in this case, the militarization of Eastern Europe. Typically, this legislation is passed in the annual National Defense Authorization Act, which is usually a huge document. It sets some military policy and military budget levels, and there are all kinds of stipulations packed in there. I mean, it would be, if you have the time and the inclination, read one of these documents. It's just, and these documents are constantly demonizing and inflating threats, you know, like the world is all, like the United States is somehow facing an existential threat from everyone, always, including Venezuela and Cuba and Iran, countries that just want to live. The White House also has legal authority. It has something called Presidential Drawdown Authority that allows further transfer from US war industry to European governments, but it also can be used to transfer from US military stockpiles to those governments. Wait, let me go back one. State Department, bottom of the screen here. State Department in November of last year signed the DC Kiev, quote, Charter on Strategic Partnership. This is another step of all that we've covered. This is another step that can be seen as the US encroaching upon Russia. We must, if we ever want a diplomatic solution to this, we must understand what the other side sees. Whether we're right, whether we are wrong, whether they're right, whether they're wrong, we have to put ourselves in their shoes. So it brings us to Ukraine. During 2014 through January 2022, the US government, quote, and this is according to the State Department, committed over $2.7 billion in training and equipment. Okay. 2.7 billion in training and equipment. Anthony Blinken said on C-SPAN in January of this year of the Biden administration's efforts, quote, "We provided more defensive security systems in the past year than any year previous." Defensive security systems, by the way, whenever you see euphemism, defensive security systems, there's hardly anything defensive about it. It doesn't have anything to do with security. These are weapons. These are weapons of war. Sales over the past several years from the U.S. war industry to Ukraine have included anti-tank systems, boats, sniper rifles, unarmed drones, numerous classified sales that we'll never see, body armor, communication equipment, construction equipment, land vehicles, night vision, on and on. So there are many ways that the US government gets equipment into Eastern European countries' hands, and in this case, into Ukraine's hands. And it has many programs and many legal authorities to do this. One of them is called excess defense articles. So you are familiar with the 1033 program that gained notoriety during the summer 2020 protests in favor of civil rights. It was a mass uprising against police brutality and in favor of civil rights for all. The 1033 program gained notoriety during this time because the 1033 program is one of the ways that the Pentagon gets its excess military goods into the hands of local and state police throughout the United States. Well, it has a comparable program that does the exact same thing, gets excess Pentagon supplies and equipment into other governments' hands. And so there's this thing called excess defense articles. These war industry goods are sold at a reduced price or with the help of US government grants. The customer, that is the government that receives the goods overseas, pays just for shipping and handling. So there are many different ways that the US war industry goods and services get into the hands of allied governments. Those are some of the ways listed right there. The key point is that these programs divvy out war industry goods and services, and that the military-industrial complex comes before the conflict. The military-industrial complex came before this current Ukraine conflict. It was there long before, it'll be there long after. And by the way, it's doing the exact same thing with Taiwan right now. It's been doing this with Taiwan for a very long time. And when that conflict inevitably pops off down the road, and people are like, "Oh, well, what's going on?" Well, we didn't know. And corporate media is like, "Oh, the dastardly Chinese." You know that the US war industry has been arming Taiwan to the teeth, sticking its nose where it doesn't belong, pretending that it cares about democracy. It's been arming South Korea. It's been arming Japan against Japan's constitution, mind you, and on and on and on.
Christian,
Yes,
I wonder if we may shortly open it up for questions.
absolutely. Two slides left, good sir.
Okay.
Thank you. So sometimes these foreign countries pay for them out of their own tax dollars, pay for these goods and services out of their own tax dollars. Sometimes they use US government money. There's something called foreign military financing. So it's loans and grants from the US government to a given country, and then that country can then buy from the war industry. So it's basically an indirect transfer from US government coffers into the war industry. And in the case of Ukraine and many of these countries, if you want foreign military financing, if you want free money to buy from the US war industry, then you must make yourself interoperable with NATO. So that's what Ukraine has been doing for the past several years. The US government has its PR talking points. The US government has been training Ukrainian forces nonstop for the last several years, including CIA training Ukrainian paramilitary and intelligence forces. The US government has nukes stationed in at least 5 European countries, according to the FAA, the FAS, the Federation of Atomic Scientists, I believe it's called. The US is reviving old Cold War nuclear missile units. And importantly, the US is rejecting diplomacy. According to the Washington Post, March
Yeah.
25, Secretary Blinken has not attempted any conversations with his counterpart, Foreign Minister of Russia. Some of the fellows. On top of that, we have the big elephant in the room, NATO expansion, right up to Russia's borders. All right, we're good. Questions, please.
Okay. As the host, what I'm going to do is, Christian, I want to ask you 2 questions, and then we'll open it up for everybody else. And the first question that I have, I want to come back to NATO expansion and the crisis in Ukraine. But the first question I want to ask is about taxes, because we've had this talk as part of a tax day event. And among your strategies, one thing that I didn't see, and one thing that I think is interesting to talk about, is the legal ways in which you can not pay taxes to the Pentagon. I'm wondering if you could say a few words about that.
I plead almost complete ignorance on that. I know there is a group called, I think, War Tax Resistors.
Yeah.
You can find their work online, but I honestly do not know much about that. One of the organizations that I do not want to fall afoul of is the is the IRS. I'm sure there are creative legal ways to do this. One of the problems is, though, is that the Pentagon pays for war in 2 ways. It pays for war through taxes, but it also pays for war through issuance of debt, and it does that through selling Treasury marketable securities. And so, even if somehow its tax stream was cut off or substantially diminished tomorrow, it still has substantial financial resources at its disposal. As we know, it's never passed an audit. It has paid many corporations, including the large Big Four accounting firms, to conduct this audit. But so far, several years running, it has proven to be quite the beast in terms of opacity and what it does with its finances. And on top of that, military intelligence, as its budgets are classified, goes against the stipulations in the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, that say, hey, you have to provide a public accounting of all of your expenditures to the people every year. So the military intelligence and civilian intelligence agencies in the U.S. government are anti-constitutional in that regard. And they have all manner of ways to pay for their goods and services and their activities, and they're off the books. CIA in particular has no legal requirement beyond the constitutional imperative. It has no legal requirement to provide any sort of accounting other than the director of Central DCI, the director of Central Intelligence Agency, basically saying, providing in writing, hey, yeah, we're good, and that's it. So yeah, I can't speak to the war tax resistors, but there is information out there if anybody wants to search it. I apologize, I'm not well versed in that.
Yeah, fair enough. That group is called for everyone listening, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. And it's a great resource for legal ways, in fact, that you can avoid paying part of your taxes so that they don't go toward the Pentagon. The second question that I wanted to ask you, Christian, is something that you actually did address towards the end, but it was a little bit compressed. A lot of people are arguing, I think, persuasively on all sides of the political spectrum, that one of the main facilitating causes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the fact that the United States has simply refused to negotiate with Russia over its security concerns regarding, one, NATO expansion, and then also the militarized status of Ukraine and the neutral status of Ukraine. And the Biden administration has refused to negotiate on that, in particular during negotiations in December of 2021 and January 2022, right before the invasion happened. Would you explain the Biden administration's refusal to negotiate in terms of their support for the war industry and the military industrial complex, and because expansion of NATO is profitable?
Yeah, I think you hit first of all, very good question. I think you hit the nail on the head. The Biden administration, if you look at it, comes from the war industry, comes from large corporations, is capitalist through and through, and it is by and for the military industrial complex. It has no professional or financial incentive to alter the existing arrangement of authority and corporate power at all. In fact, whenever the Biden administration winds up, if we make it that far as a species, say there's another presidential administration coming in, but I guarantee you, you watch, you will see them rotate back into very, very lucrative corporate positions, including but not limited to the war industry itself, but also consulting firms and Silicon Valley firms as well. And then on top of that, we must step back and just note that whether you're capitalist or anti-capitalist or whatever your economic ideology is, the job of a capitalist government is to create the conditions in which capitalists can profit. That is the system. And we must acknowledge that and understand that. It is not to confine corporate profit at all. And the Democrats do that as well as the Republican Party. Democrats have better public relations, and they appeal to a slightly different sector of the electorate, but they are also capitalists through and through, and they make no bones about that. They, that's their job. So NATO expansion has been incredibly profitable. The U.S., if you want to join NATO, you have to standardize your military to NATO, which essentially means standardize your military to the U.S. war industry. And so then it's basically another customer. And there's been some really good reporting in independent media lately regarding the early expansion of NATO after the Cold War and the lobbying by the U.S. war industry that went into that expansion during the Clinton administration. I believe there was an article on Counterpunch within the last month, if anybody out there wants to look at it. And I believe in these times also, even actually, I think Politico as well ran an article about that. So yeah, it's there's no financial or professional incentive to stop this. And it's madness. It's absolute madness, because you need to, with diplomacy, give somebody an out. You don't have to like them. You don't have to support them. You have to give them an out. There is give and take. And the US government has made no effort, not just no effort at diplomacy, it's not giving someone an out. If you call someone a war criminal, whether they are or they aren't, if you call your negotiating partner or potential negotiating partner a war criminal and say, hey, as soon as this conflict ends, you're going into the International Criminal Court, you're confining the person's options even more. And if you are, throughout this entire thing, just flooding your side with more and more weapons, every few weeks there's another several $100 million package from the Biden administration that basically says, all right, this is money that you can get, and this is more war industry goods and services that you can get. It is an absolute nightmare. And no matter what side you're on, we have to understand that this nuclear brinksmanship, where we are fighting a proxy war that we largely created in Eastern Europe against another nuclear power. And if you put that nuclear power in a box, you are playing with fire. And yeah, it's a very, very frightening, terrifying moment in history. And it's exciting because it's exciting insofar as it's the youth of the United States and the world are well aware of the nature of the beast. They understand to a large extent that their future is more or less doomed, and that the system is completely unresponsive to their needs. And so by definition, they are eventually going to rise up one way or another, because they understand intuitively and in the government's own actions that the government is not responsive to what they need. So it's a terrifying time to be alive, but it's also very exciting because it is do or die for the younger generations.
Randy, I suggested people put questions into the chat. So there's a couple of questions, one from Karen Tinklenberg and one from John Kleinhetzel. Can you see them?
Yep, I pulled them up.
Christian?
Yeah, I have them up here. Would you like me to read them?
Sure.
Okay. Christian, we have one question here in the chat. It says, can I obtain a list of US corporations that contract with the Pentagon for divestment purposes?
Absolutely. Karen, if you are part of the No group, I will email Randy that list, but it's also, I'll put this in the chat. It's also available at my website, warindustrymuster.com. You can click on corporate distillations and see the large war corporations that are involved in this, not just the militarization of Eastern Europe, but the game of war profiteering in general. Good question.
You know what's interesting, Christian, is I tried to use Google to search for your website recently, and it did not come up. That website did not come up.
I believe it. There have been Silicon Valley has responded very well to requests from the larger permanent warfare state to suppress alternative sources of information that are not corporate. And so it's one of the more effective forms of censorship. If you don't come up in the Google list, that's how a lot of people find their information when they're searching for things. And it's so World Socialist website has had trouble, independent journalists, even comedians, Lee Camp has had trouble with that. Yeah, across the board. So if you present a truthful and dissenting opinion or a truthful opinion at all about the nature of the permanent warfare state, you're struck from the record. I didn't know that. It doesn't surprise me though. I do recommend I use DuckDuckGo for searches, and so far that has been slightly better than Google. It's far from perfect, but it does come up with non-capitalist and alternative sources of information, as well as pro-peace websites like, Counterpunch or Popular Resistance or any of those sites. So interesting to know, though.
Yeah. I'll read this next question, and then if anybody wants to ask a question just over their microphone, they can do that. The next question here is, it is clear that the US is completely committed to the Pax Americana against a resurgent China or Russia. How long will China how long will China finance our bankrupt economy before calling in the chips?
I'm no fortune teller. I'm no prognosticator, and it's tough to make a guess on that. It's difficult because the economies are so intertwined in so many different ways. At the same time, the ruling class of the United States needs to and wants to demonize China as the new official number one bad guy in order to sustain the permanent warfare state. But while it does that, it also realizes that, hey, we, the US ruling class, have made untold billions of dollars off of cheap Chinese labor. And, we outsource, capital outsources US jobs in general, it goes where labor is cheapest. So it will, the goods and services that we use every day in the United States are made not just in China, but in Honduras, in Bangladesh, in Southeast Asia, all across the world. It goes where labor is cheapest. And so at the same time it needs an enemy in the form of China, it also recognizes that the economies are completely intertwined. And so I don't know how that's going to play out, but it is terrifying what the US Navy does and what the US Air Force does along China's borders all the time. The US Air Force flies reconnaissance planes all along China's borders all the time. The US Navy is constantly sailing what it calls freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea and between China and Taiwan, mainland China and Taiwan. It is a big middle finger to Beijing every single time it does this. Again, it is not the Chinese or the Russians, in Long Island Sound. It's not, them off the coast of Cape Cod. It's not them, off of Galveston, Texas. It is us in their face, just saying, hey.
Well, we have good intentions though, right? And their intentions are bad.
That's the game. That's the game, is we are the good guys. That's one of the ways that the ruling class lies to the American public all the time, to the working class all the time. And their lies are nothing new. It is that we have good intentions, we fight for freedom, we spread democracy. Now, when you see this on the ground and when you understand independent reporting and when you read prominent social critics like Noam Chomsky or Michael Parenti or anybody, you see the truth. But the lies are very powerful, and they come through every day, not just in Hollywood, but also in corporate media. And so it's very hard to snap out of this stuff. So the messaging it's the big lie. It's the big lie. And it is told again and again, and it's in our face. And, fortunately there is a old guard, like many US peace groups, of people who are, my parents' age, who have laid the groundwork and kept the spirit of peace alive in this country, upon which the younger generations who are facing a real do or die scenario can build. And so there is an awakened consciousness, and there is hope. It's small, but there is hope. So.
In fact, Christian, if you want to say any more about that, the last question maybe that we'll take here is, do you think that the US peace movement can be effective in this moment to make progress against nuclear weapons because of the current threat?
The US war, this invasion, this Russian invasion of Ukraine, is such a gift to the US war industry, because what the US war industry does through its corporate media and its think tanks and its punditry and its PR apparatuses is constantly hyping threats. It is constantly saying the Chinese are 10 feet tall, the Russians are 10 feet tall, the Venezuelans, the Cubans, they're 10 feet tall, the Iranians are 10 feet tall, the North Koreans are 10 feet tall. All these official enemies of the day are out to get us, and they're going to destroy us. But there's usually very little actual concrete evidence of this. And so this invasion has been such a gift, because what it allows is the further militarization of our society, the further sale of war industry goods and services to the US government, to intelligence agencies, and to allied capitalist governments around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe. It's basically a steroid shot in the thigh of the war industry, of the permanent warfare state, at a time when we absolutely need to be kicking this thing to the curb and moving on and uniting as a species. So I'm optimistic a little bit, because there are so many stresses on the system right now that the ruling class, no matter who's in power, is completely unable to respond to all that is pressing on it. So you have ecological collapse of ecosystems. You have current and exacerbating climate crises. You have inequality that this country, and indeed the world, has never seen right here in the United States, that is exacerbating class conflict. You have all of this, you have a internet that allows, for the time being, some communication without censorship, although the censorship has really been cracking down since the Russian invasion. But so you have so many ingredients, and as the climate crisis unfolds, the US ruling class simply cannot cope. Nobody could. They cannot continue to govern, especially as more and more people are realizing that there is plenty of money to go around. There's plenty of money for universal healthcare. There's plenty of money for education. There's plenty of money to food, for food, clothing, and shelter of everybody in the United States and indeed the world, if we allocated our resources properly. And whether the U.S. ruling class realizes it or not, the public will revolt because eventually they have no choice. And I'm not advocating for revolution, certainly in this public forum right now, but I am indeed saying that it is absolutely what is coming because the American public, the workers, understand that they have been screwed over systematically again and again. They have created the profit that the ruling class just takes, and then it takes that profit and screws them over again because there is no investment in in programs of social uplift in this country, let alone in the world. So I am optimistic, but the species is going to have a very, very difficult time in the near future, and we'll see what happens. But we have to, even if it's complete doom and gloom, we must maintain hope because hope is crucial. We can't just pack it in and call it a day. We got to keep the hope alive. And indeed, groups like No and other peace groups provide that hope. So many thanks to all of you. So thank you.
Christian, this has been a very fantastic and a very comprehensive discussion, a very concise and informative discussion. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you, No. Thank you, Kalamazoo. Thank you, Randy, Daniel, Steve, and John. Thank you all. And please stay in touch. I really appreciate all the work you do, and future generations do as well. So thank you all.
We appreciate you too, Christian. Thank you.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.